The rain doesn't fall gently on nights like this. It comes down in sheets, heavy, relentless, the kind of rain that feels like the sky itself is trying to say something. It floods the gutters of a quiet neighborhood in Lagos, where the streets are narrow and the houses sit close together like old friends who never left. One house in particular sits at the end of a short lane. It is modest, painted soft cream, a small garden in the front carefully tended, bougainvillea climbing the left wall in wild, brilliant purple. Wind chimes on the porch, whispering softly even in the storm. The lights inside are warm. Someone lives here who loves this house. Then the knock comes. It's slow. 3 knocks. Almost hesitant, like the hand behind them is not sure it has the right to touch this door. Inside, a woman looks up from her book. She is 66 years old. Her hair is silver now. She stopped fighting that years ago. She wears a simple housecoat, reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. There is a cup of rooibos tea on the side table still steaming. A cat, orange and enormous, sleeps at her feet. Her name is Grace. And she has learned, over the past 3 years, exactly what that name means. She walks to the door slowly. Not from weakness, from choice. Grace has learned not to rush toward anything anymore. She has learned that most things worth having will wait. She opens the door, and the world stops. Standing in the rain, soaked through to his expensive bones, is a man she once loved with every chamber of her heart. A man she once slept beside for 38 years, whose breathing she knew better than her own. A man who, 3 years ago, sat across from her in a conference room full of lawyers and signed his name to the end of their marriage. Seung-Woo, 68 years old, one of the wealthiest men in Asia. A man whose name appears in Forbes lists and business journals and whispered conversations in corporate boardrooms from Seoul to Singapore. He looks nothing like any of those things right now. His suit is drenched. His silver hair is flattened against his forehead. His hands, those steady, certain hands that once built an empire, are trembling. His eyes are red, not from the rain. He has been crying. For a long moment, neither of them speaks. The rain fills the silence between them. The wind chimes sing. The cat meows somewhere behind Grace, curious about the intrusion. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, a voice that carries 38 years of history and 3 years of consequence, he says, "I was wrong." Grace does not move. She does not smile. She does not cry. She does not slam the door. She simply looks at him, with those deep, quiet eyes that have always seen more than most people want to be seen. And the story begins. If you enjoy emotional stories about love, regret, second chances, and life-changing decisions, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's begin. You have to understand something about Seung-Woo. He was not born wealthy. He was born in Busan, South Korea, in 1957, the 3rd son of a fisherman who smelled of the sea and never quite lost that salt rough quality even on Sundays. They were not poor in the way that destroys people, but they were the kind of poor that teaches, the kind that makes you feel the absence of things, warmth, certainty, the particular confidence that comes from knowing there will be food tomorrow. Seung-Woo learned early that desire could be a compass. He watched the ships come in and the ships go out, and he decided that one day he would own one, then several, then a fleet. He was 24 when he met Grace Adeyemi. She was visiting Korea as part of a cultural exchange program, fresh from Lagos, clutching a map she could barely read, laughing at herself with a freedom that stopped him cold. He saw her from across a street market standing in front of a pojangmasha stall, trying to negotiate the price of tteokbokki with a vendor who spoke no English, using hand gestures and sheer audacious charm. He watched her win. He told a colleague later, that woman could negotiate peace between nations. They met properly at a university event 3 days later. Grace was studying economics. She had plans, real, structured, detailed plans, for what she was going to do with her degree, with her life, with the world. She talked about Nigeria with a love so fierce it could light a room. Seung-Woo was just starting his first business, importing small electronics, barely surviving. He told her about his dream, not the polished version he told investors, the raw one, the boy from Busan watching ships, the hunger that never really left, the fear that sat behind every ambition, like a shadow. She listened to every word. Then she said, "Tell me the plan." Not the dream, the plan. He laughed so hard the table shook. They were married 2 years later, in a ceremony that confused both families and delighted everyone who witnessed it. A Korean fisherman's son and a Nigerian economist's daughter, standing in a garden in Seoul, making promises in front of people who weren't entirely sure it would last. It lasted 38 years, and in that time, Grace was not a background figure. She was not a quiet wife who smiled at functions and stayed out of the way. She was the architect of everything that didn't appear on the balance sheets. When his first business failed, and it did fail spectacularly at 28, it was Grace who sat with him at their kitchen table at 2 a.m. while he stared at numbers that refused to cooperate. She didn't offer empty comfort. She spread out his books, found 3 errors that had compounded into catastrophe, and said, "This is fixable. Let's fix it." When his second venture nearly collapsed because a partner stole from the company, it was Grace who kept him from making a decision in anger that would have destroyed his reputation and his future at the same time. When he was 35 and finally, broke through with a real estate development in Incheon that changed everything, he stood on the roof of that first building and called her from a payphone. He was crying then too, but differently. "Grace," he said, "we made it." "You made it," she said. "I just kept the lights on." She was wrong about that, but she would never hear it from him. Not nearly enough. Success does something to people, not all people and not all at once. It's not a sudden transformation, it's a slow erosion, like the sea working against a cliff face. You don't notice it's happening until the shape has changed entirely. Seung-Woo became Han Seung-Woo the billionaire gradually, and the man who emerged over 2 decades was both everything the Busan fisherman's son had dreamed of and, quietly, something Grace began to recognize less and less. The private jets arrived, the penthouse in Seoul, the apartment in London, the villa in Jeju, the staff, the functions, the photographs, the introductions at parties where people laughed too loudly and said too little. Grace attended when she was needed. She was always composed, always graceful. The name had become a description long before it became ironic. She wore her elegance lightly, something natural rather than performed. Seung-Woo's associates adored her. His rivals respected her. His children, they had 3, 2 sons, Min-jun and Ji-hoon, and a daughter, So-yeon, worshipped her. But somewhere in the architecture of the empire, there was a room that Seung-Woo had sealed off. It was the room where he and Grace actually talked. The conversations that once lasted until sunrise had been replaced by schedules. His calendar was managed by 3 assistants. Grace learned to book time with her own husband. She didn't complain, not to others, but she noticed. She stored the noticing somewhere private and kept moving. Then, at 65, Seung-Woo had a crisis. Not a financial one, not a health one. The most dangerous kind. A crisis of meaning. He began to feel with growing urgency that his life had become a museum of accomplishments with no living exhibits, that every room had been built, furnished, and finished, and there was nothing left to want. He looked at his wife of 38 years across the breakfast table and felt, and this is what he confessed to his son Ji-hoon years later with a shame that barely fit into words. He felt bored. Not by Grace, not truly, but by the version of himself that he was when he was with her. The responsible one, the accountable one, the man who had a history, a context, a family that remembered every version of him, including the ones he preferred to forget. He wanted to be new again. He wanted to be young again. And there was a woman who made him feel that way. Her name was Yuna. She was 38, a marketing executive in one of his subsidiary companies. Smart, beautiful, ambitious. In many ways, not unlike Grace at that age, but unlike Grace, she didn't know the version of Seung-Woo who had failed. She only knew the empire. He told himself it was love. He told himself he deserved this. He told himself that 38 years was a complete life, a full chapter, and that beginning a new one wasn't destruction, it was evolution. He did not tell himself the truth. Grace found out the way she found out most things, quietly, by paying attention. A change in his phone habits, a new carefulness with his schedule. A warmth in his voice when certain calls came in that he'd stopped using with her some years ago. She didn't scream. She didn't hire a detective. She didn't confront him with evidence like a prosecutor preparing a case. She waited until a Thursday evening in October, when the Seoul apartment was quiet and he came home later than his assistant had told her to expect. She had made dinner, doenjang jjigae, his mother's recipe, which she had learned from a woman who'd initially looked at her with polite suspicion, and gradually, over the course of many shared kitchens and grandchildren, come to love her. She set the bowl in front of him and sat down across the table. She said, "Tell me the truth. I would rather hear it from you." He looked at her for a long time, and she would replay this moment for years. He didn't apologize. He didn't fall apart. He sat up straighter and said, "I think it's time for us to move on. Both of us." As if it were a business restructuring, as if 38 years could be itemized and redistributed. Grace was quiet for a very long time. Then she stood, picked up her bowl, and said, "I'll be gone by the weekend." She was. The divorce was handled with devastating efficiency. Seung-Woo's lawyers were thorough. Grace's lawyer, a childhood friend from Lagos who owed her more than professional loyalty, made sure she was treated fairly. The settlement was significant. She did not fight for more than was reasonable, which surprised people who expected her to. When Min-jun, their eldest, called her from Los Angeles where he lived with his family, furious and heartbroken on her behalf, she said, "Don't hate your father. Hate changes nothing. I am going to be fine." He didn't believe her. He would. Lagos in the rainy season smells like earth waking up. Grace had grown up here, left at 20, and now at 66 she returned to a city that had changed enormously, and not at all. Still chaotic, still generous, still full of noise and colour, and the kind of life that insists on itself no matter what. She found the house through a real estate agent who kept apologising for its modesty, not knowing who she was, not knowing she had specifically asked for modest. She planted the bougainvillea herself, bought wind chimes from a market stall in Yaba, found the orange cat wandering the lane, and named him Socrates for no particular reason other than he looked like someone who had questions. And then she began, at 66, to find out who she was when she wasn't Han Seung-Woo's wife. It was both harder and more beautiful than she expected. She joined a women's book club that met every other Thursday in a members' sitting room near Victoria Island. 6 women, ranging from 40 to 74, all carrying different versions of lives that had been complicated by love, loss, ambition, and time. Grace didn't tell them about the billions. She told them about the books. She began writing. Not for publication. Not at first. Just journals. Thick, black-covered notebooks that she filled in the mornings with her tea, writing down everything she remembered, and everything she felt, and everything she was only now, after 66 years, allowing herself to understand. The writing became essays. The essays became, slowly, a manuscript that a friend who ran a small Lagos publisher read and would not give back. She travelled. Not on private jets, not to functions. She took a train across Nigeria with a group of retired teachers who were documenting traditional architecture before it disappeared. She spent 2 weeks in Ghana photographing markets. She went to Cape Town and walked the waterfront alone at dawn and felt, for the first time in perhaps decades, entirely free. She learned that loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Loneliness is an ache. Solitude is a room of one's own. Grace had been lonely inside her marriage for years without knowing it, and now that she was alone, she was never lonely at all. Her daughter So-yeon visited in the second year, flying from Seoul with her husband and their twin girls, and spent 3 weeks in the cream house. She arrived expecting to find her mother diminished. She found her radiant. She cried twice. Once from relief, once from something harder to name. On the last evening before they left, she held her mother's hands across the table and said, "You're the strongest person I know." Grace said, "I had a good teacher." "Who?" "Your father taught me what loyalty means, what it means not to have it." So-yeon looked at her carefully. "Do you hate him?" Grace thought for a long moment. "No," she said. "I used to think I would. But hate is heavy, and I've been carrying things for other people my whole life. I put that down too." He told himself it was going well. He and Yoona moved into the Jeju villa. The press covered it with the specific combination of judgment and fascination reserved for wealthy men who make spectacular personal mistakes. He ignored the coverage. He had always been good at ignoring inconvenient truths. The first year had moments of genuine happiness. New things are always interesting. New people are always mysterious. But mystery, Seung-Woo discovered, has an expiration date, and once the mystery fades, you are left with the ordinary. And the ordinary, without 38 years of shared understanding to give it texture, can be very thin indeed. Yoona was not a villain. She was a woman who had fallen for a man she believed she understood, only to discover that the man behind the empire was more complicated, more demanding, more haunted than she had anticipated. She had expected a partner. She had not expected to become a mirror for his regrets. They argued about things that Grace had never argued with him about. Not because Grace was passive, but because Grace understood him well enough to know when an argument was actually about something else. Yoona did not have that map. His children were another matter entirely. Min-jun, who had always been the diplomat, stopped returning his calls for 4 months. When they reconnected, the conversation was civil and irreparably changed. Ji-hoon, the youngest, who had always been closest to his mother, barely masked his contempt. Only So-yeon maintained full contact with both parents, navigating the wreckage of their family with an exhausting, careful grace that her mother would have recognized as learned. At his granddaughter's birthday, Min-jun's daughter turning 6, Seung-Woo sat at the end of a table surrounded by his family and felt completely alone. He watched his grandchildren run to Grace's photograph on the wall, So-yeon had put it there conspicuously, and point to her and chatter. He watched his son's wife interact with Yoona with the impeccable politeness of someone who has been raised correctly and dislikes who she is speaking to. He watched all of it and thought, "This is what I chose." The realizations didn't come in one thunderclap. They came in pieces, like a mosaic assembling itself against his will. He remembered that Grace always knew when he hadn't eaten, not by asking, by putting food in front of him. He remembered that she alone could tell the difference between his thinking silence and his suffering silence. He remembered the way she argued with him, never to wound, always to improve. He remembered that she had learned Korean, then learned Busan dialect specifically, then learned his mother's recipes, and had done all of this not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted to understand everything about the life she had chosen. He remembered the doenjang jjigae. He woke up one morning in the Jeju villa, 67 years old, lying next to a woman who was asleep and peaceful and not Grace, and thought, "What have I done?" He didn't say it aloud. He was still too proud for that, but the thought had arrived, and it did not leave. This is the part the story has been building toward. This is the thing that broke Han Seung-Woo. It wasn't losing Yoona, though they did end, quietly, near the end of the second year, parting with sadness rather than drama, both of them aware that what they had built together was a monument to someone else's mistake. It wasn't the business pressure, though the market had turned and two of his major developments were underperforming and his board had begun wearing the particular expression of men who are considering their options. It wasn't any of the things people expected. It was a notebook. So-yeon had been cleaning out a storage room in the Seoul apartment. Seung-Woo had asked her to send some things to him in Jeju. And she found, in a box that Grace had apparently overlooked when she left, a collection of notebooks, old ones, going back decades. She sent them to her father without comment. He opened the first one on an evening in March, sitting on the Jeju veranda with the sea in front of him. He thought they were financial notes, old records. They were not. They were Grace's private journals. The ones she had kept throughout their marriage. The record of her interior life that he had never seen, never known existed. Her real thoughts, her real feelings, all of it. He read through the night. He read about the early years, when they had nothing, and how she had written about him with a love so pure and specific that it had no performance in it. She was writing to herself, honestly, with no audience. She had written about his dreams with more faith than he had ever felt in himself. She had written, "He doesn't see what I see. He thinks he is ordinary. He has no idea." He read about the business failures, about the nights she had stayed awake worrying while he slept, protecting him from her fear because he needed her certainty. He read about the years of the empire, how the silence had grown, how she had written, "I think he has forgotten that I knew him before. I remember everything. I wonder sometimes if that frightens him. And later, I will love him from wherever I am. I don't think I have a choice in that. But I am starting to understand that love and marriage are not the same thing. One can survive without the other." And then, this was the page that undid him. He found an entry dated 2 weeks before she left. After he had told her it was time to move on. She had written, "He thinks he is leaving for something new. He is actually leaving for something empty. I know him. I know this about him. Someday he will understand what he has given up. I will not be waiting, but I will not be bitter either. I choose to be grateful." 38 years, 3 remarkable children. 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays that were actually everything. It is enough. It has to be enough. I am going to make it enough. He closed the notebook. And Han Seung-Woo, who had not truly wept in decades, not since his mother's funeral, not since those early desperate years in Busan, put his face in his hands and cried like a man who has finally, irreversibly, understood the price of what he threw away. He cried for 3 hours. Then he booked a flight to Lagos, back to the rain, back to the cream house on the quiet lane, back to the wind chimes and the bougainvillea and the warm light in the windows. Grace is standing in the doorway. Seung-Woo is standing in the rain. He is holding the notebook. She sees it. She recognizes it. Something moves across her face. A complicated thing. Not quite hurt, and not quite surprise. The face of someone whose private world has just been unexpectedly returned to them. "I was wrong," he says again, because the first time she didn't respond, and he needs her to hear it. "I know," she says. "Grace, you're soaked," she says. "You'll get ill." She opens the door wider. He understands this is not an invitation back. It is not reconciliation. It is Grace. Being Grace. The woman who can separate her personal pain from basic human decency. Who would not leave a drenched man on her doorstep regardless of who he was or what he had done. He steps inside. Socrates inspects him from the doorway of the sitting room, thoroughly unimpressed by wealth. She goes to make tea. He stands in her hallway, dripping on her floor, looking at a home that is entirely, completely her. Books everywhere, photographs of the grandchildren, a framed certificate from a Nigerian literary society, a shelf of travel photographs, evidence of a life that is full and purposeful and has nothing to do with him. He feels the full weight of that. She comes back with 2 cups and gestures for him to sit. He does. She sits across from him, as she always did. The same configuration as that October evening when everything changed, but different now in ways that matter. He puts the notebook on the table between them. "You read it," she says. "All of them." She wraps her hands around her cup. "Those were private." "I know, so Yon didn't realize." "I'm not blaming her." A pause. "What do you want, Seung-Woo?" The question is simple, it has no malice. It is just a woman asking a man to be honest, which is all she has ever asked of him. He looks at his hands. Those hands that built an empire and shook the right hands and signed the wrong papers and threw away the best thing they ever touched. "I don't know if I have the right to want anything," he says. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 15 years, she says. He looks up. There is something in her eyes that is neither cold nor warm. It is the look of a woman who is completely present, completely herself, and completely unpredictable. "Your book," he says. "So Yon told me. You wrote a book." "I did." She said, "It's beautiful." "It is. No false modesty. It's the best thing I've ever made." He almost smiles. "Better than our children." "Different category." Silence. The rain eases slightly. The wind chimes slow. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," he says. "I don't think I could live with myself if I came here to ask for something. I just needed you to know." His voice breaks, just once. "I needed you to know that I understand now. What you were. What you did. What I had." Grace looks at him for a long time. Then she says something he does not expect. "I know you do," she says. "I've known for about a year. So Yon tells me more than she realizes." He stares at her. "Then why am I surprised to see you?" "I'm not." She sets down her cup. "I just wasn't sure you'd actually come. Knowing something and doing something are very different things. You always knew the right thing, Seung-Woo. You just didn't always do it." The truth of that lands in him like a stone in still water. "What happens now?" he asks. And his voice is so small, so unrecognizable from the man who once commanded boardrooms, that something behind Grace's eyes shifts almost imperceptibly. She stands. She takes her cup. She moves toward the hallway. At the doorway she stops. She doesn't turn fully. He can see her profile, the silver hair, the straight spine, the woman who has built an entire life in 3 years and wears it quietly but completely. "You can stay in the guest room tonight," she says. "The rain is too heavy to drive in. Tomorrow we'll see." She pauses. "Only tomorrow," she adds. "Not everything at once, just tomorrow." Then she's gone, footsteps quiet on the tiled floor. Han Seung-Woo sits alone in her sitting room, holding a cold cup of tea, surrounded by the evidence of everything he walked away from and everything she has become without him. Socrates, the cat, jumps onto the chair beside him and settles there with the authority of a creature who knows exactly whose house this is. Outside, the rain is slowing. Tomorrow. Just tomorrow. Some people spend their whole lives confusing wealth for worth. Some people mistake comfort for love, and stillness for safety, and familiarity for diminishment. Some people realize their mistake too late. Some people, if they are very lucky, and if the person they wronged is very extraordinary, get one more tomorrow. Whether one tomorrow becomes 2, becomes a week, becomes a conversation that turns into something neither of them can fully name yet, that story is still being written. But here is what we know. A woman who was told she was not enough went away and became more than she had ever been. A man who believed he was chasing something better discovered he had left everything behind. And on a rainy night in Lagos, In a modest house with bougainvillea on the wall and a cat named Socrates who has no patience for nonsense, two people sat across from each other with decades of history between them and one single fragile word in the air. Tomorrow. Not a promise. Not a pardon. Just a door, left slightly open. What happens when tomorrow comes? That is a story for part 2. But before you go, if Grace opened that door tonight, would you? If you were in her position, 3 years of healing, a life rebuilt, a self rediscovered, could you give tomorrow to the person who took everything? Think about that. And if this story moved something in you, if it made you think about the people in your life, the things you've said, or the things you haven't, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you in part 2.